The Horipad for Steam is an interesting one. It's the first controller made by a third party for use with Steam. It's also got some exclusive functionality when used with Steam as well. This was actually sent over by a viewer of mine, so I appreciate it, thank you very much. This controller isn't officially available outside of Japan, and as such it'll be more expensive than if you lived in Japan. But anyways, let's get this out of the way first. This is no Steam controller. Now let's talk about the actual controller itself. The unboxing experience is pretty simple. The box doesn't come with too many things. It comes with documentation that's entirely in Japanese. It also comes with the controller itself and a USB cable, and a USB dongle as well. The USB dongle is a Bluetooth dongle, so you won't need it for use with the Steam Deck. So the controller is exclusively Bluetooth. So when I first picked up this controller, the controller feels really light, like concerningly light. Yes, this controller is a fair bit lighter than most of the controllers that I do own. I suppose it also helps that this controller doesn't have any vibration motors. And no, there are no haptics either. The controller feels cheap, much cheaper than its around $54 USD price tag would indicate. But there are additional unconventional technologies in this controller as well, which might make it worth the price. But we'll talk about that later. The controller comes with a full complement of standard controls. It's got your D-pad, your thumbsticks, your face buttons, start and select, bumpers, triggers, and yes, even gyro. But there's some additional features that this controller comes with. The controller comes with 2 sets of macro buttons, 2 on the grip and 2 right below the thumbsticks. These days, additional macro buttons on the back of a controller have become commonplace. As for the macro buttons underneath, well, we'll talk about that later. The thumbsticks featured on this controller are also capacitive thumbsticks, much like the Steam Deck itself. If you're unfamiliar, or maybe you've just never used these on your Steam Deck, these capacitive thumbsticks can actuate a function just by touching it. While these can be mapped to basically any function, whether it's a gamepad function or a keyboard or mouse function, it's best used as a way to actuate gyro. One issue I always have with gyro is that gyro is always on, even when you're not touching the stick, when you don't intend to move or anything. By having the right capacitive thumbstick actuate the gyro only actuates when your thumb is on the thumbstick. Not even moving it, just having the thumb on the thumbstick is enough. It's a literal game changer for gyro, and more controllers need a function like that. And let's talk about the triggers. At first glance, the triggers aren't analog. They look like they're just hair triggers like you'd find on a Nintendo Switch. But these are actually pressure sensitive triggers. They give off an analog value based on how hard you're pressing down the trigger. While yes, this is objectively better than just having straight digital triggers, the fact of the matter is it still doesn't feel as nice as using real analog triggers. But while we're in the neighborhood of unusual trigger designs, imagine if this had dual stage triggers, much like the GameCube controller or the Steam controller. Hooking this up to your Steam Deck is as easy as using a regular Bluetooth controller. Just hold that Steam button and it'll turn on. If this is your first time turning this controller on, then it'll go into pairing mode. But if you ever need to pair this to a different device, the pairing button is on the left. What makes this controller special is when it's in Steam mode, you have access to Steam input, and this controller interfaces perfectly with Steam input. So most other controllers I've covered on this channel do have macro buttons, but they're limited to just being mapped to their own controls. And unless these are specific controllers, like Xbox Elite controllers or DualSense Edge controllers, Valve doesn't tend to support these other controllers from the likes of 8BitDo, which in turn means you'll have to change your macros for every single game, every single time you change a game, which is kind of ridiculous and it makes me not want to use those macro buttons. But because this uses Steam input for all of the macro settings, you can change your macros per game. It's great for both sets of macro buttons, and I guess it's time to talk about those. The back grip macro buttons are about what you'd expect. It's kind of hard to mess those up. But the more interesting macro placements are right below the D-pad and right thumbstick. The left macro button that's right under your D-pad isn't really all that convenient to press because you have to take your thumb off of your thumbstick or D-pad. Those tend to be your movement options, and in the heat of battle, it might be inadvisable to take your thumb off of the thumbstick or D-pad. But the right macro button right under the thumbstick, well, that makes a lot more sense to be honest. I haven't thought of too many specific uses for this button, but the fact that you can just press the button, the fact that it's right under your right thumbstick, is pretty smart. It makes me wonder if maybe they should put the left macro button right under the thumbstick instead. After all, there's a lot less travel time. And now let's talk about performance, because performance is the only thing that really matters with a controller. If the controller doesn't perform well, then there's no point in having all of these neat features, right? The controller works about as well as you'd expect it to. The thumbsticks feel fine, and the tops of the thumbsticks, you know, the capacitive touch portions, those do feel like the Steam Deck thumbsticks. The face buttons do feel clicky, but they're not clicky in like a mechanical switch way, but you can feel the feedback. You know, I'm not typically a fan of Hori's buttons, especially the buttons on their fight sticks, you know, the Hayabusa buttons, but I think these are pretty darn good actually. The bumper buttons feel incredibly mushy though, and I'm not a big fan of them. And I understand that the triggers are pressure sensitive, but rather than being true digital triggers, they feel like a quarter of an analog trigger. Like an actual feel. The D-pad, however, feels incredibly stiff. Like the D-pad feels mushy and stiff at the same time, and it's hard to know what direction I'm actually pressing. Like, let's compare it to this 8-bit Do controller. I really like the D-pad on these. It pivots far enough down so that you know you're pressing left on the D-pad or right on the D-pad, whereas this Hori one doesn't do that. It also feels quite mushy as well. I feel like if you're gonna have a stiff D-pad that doesn't pivot that much, then you should have a clicky switch at the bottom to make sure you're actually pressing a direction. Kind of like what the Vita does. All in all, if you're looking to play some D-pad centric titles, you know, 2D titles and whatnot, I think there are better controllers. So the main reason why people would want to use this controller is for the gyro and also the capacitive thumbsticks. But I've noticed something weird. Over Bluetooth, the gyro seems quite jittery. Like, it's not smooth, it looks quite choppy. Like, you guys can see this, right? This is gonna be a problem because the controller can only connect via Bluetooth, and that USB dongle is also a Bluetooth dongle, so it really doesn't make a difference unless your computer just doesn't have Bluetooth. If the dongle were 2.4 GHz, kind of like some other controllers I've reviewed, then this might be a little less jittery. Of course, you can also plug this controller in and use it as a wired controller, and this fixes the jitteriness. But this isn't going to be something most people do because you don't really buy a wireless controller to be plugged in all the time, right? Could this be fixed through a firmware update? I think it could be fixed, but as it stands right now, it is jittery. The typical way you'd want to set up gyro is to press the Steam button, then go to control settings, then go into edit layout. And then after that, scroll down to gyro, all the way down to gyro. And then set gyro behavior to gyro as mouse. But of course, some games like Halo don't play well with gyro to mouse, especially if you're using a controller. In cases like that, you'll want to use gyro to joystick. And typically you would want to set the gyro activation button to that icon right there. That right there is the capacitive touchpad on the right stick, making gyro only activate when you touch the right stick. And to elaborate on that point about some games like Halo not playing well with gyro to mouse, it's simple really. A lot of competitive shooters actively prohibit you from using your mouse and controller at the same time. Sometimes there are different balance considerations, and sometimes they separate players by input type. Do keep this in mind if you want to delve into the world of gyro on PC. So all in all, the controller is an adequate controller. You can use it to play most games just fine. I wouldn't recommend it for 2D games, but that's just the nature of the beast. The controller also has some very interesting ideas, and I'll commend Hori for trying something different. And in this case, partnering up with Valve. I really do like the idea of capacitive thumbsticks, but the gyro, especially over Bluetooth, just seems very lacking. And I know most people were gonna buy it just for that, but honestly, I can't really recommend it. Not until Valve or Hori or whoever's responsible for the firmware updates it. At the end of the day, this is no Steam controller 2. It never was, and it never aspired to be a Steam controller. And while as of the making of this video the controller is kind of hit or miss for me, the promise of Valve directly working with controller manufacturers to create controllers that are Steam input compatible, that's a very worthy endeavor. If Valve were to take any suggestions, I would say Valve should work with 8-bit Do. Like if 8-bit Do were to make a Steam input compatible version of their Ultimate 2C or their Pro 2, I feel like that would be a smash hit. Same with GullyKit. Or better yet, what if Valve just open sourced their controller parts and let us make our own Steam Deck controllers with a full complement of Steam Deck controls? But part of me wants Valve to jump back into the controller scene. Make controllers again. Make a Steam controller 2, a true successor, you know, like with trackpads and stuff. Part of me wants a Steam controller that's more akin to the original, and part of me wants one that's kind of like a Steam Deck almost. Ideally 2 different controllers, but realistically all I want is for Valve to jump back into the controller scene with their own controller again. Maybe that'll happen after Valve's lawsuit with Corsair ends. If you like this video, please press the like button and check out our other videos, and if you like those other videos as well, be sure to press the subscribe button and share the good gospel of high-tech lowlife with your friends. Furthermore, we have a community Discord for enlightened individuals such as you. And if you wish to further support high-tech lowlife, be sure to check out our Patreon page. Links in the description.